Assalamualaikum and hi. Welcome to the Let's Talk series, the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, IDFR's very own talk show series. The program is a series of dialogues set to discuss on current and evolving matters of foreign policy and international affairs. And today's theme is multilateralism. The title of our Let's Talk today is a bit of a mouthful, but please bear with me. It's Multilatereality, the realities of multilateralism in the 21st century. So multilateralism plus reality, multilatereality. Right, what is the multilaterality now? As common as it may be, I don't think we can run away from the question or the issue of Ukraine-Russia. What are the actions taken by the United Nations and other multilateral systems in addressing this issue? Is it enough? Are they doing enough? Is it working? To discuss the matter further, we are privileged to have three distinguished panelists with us today. Speaking of which, allow me to introduce our wonderful lineup of panelists, all ladies. Right, first we have Ms. Aznifa Isnaria Abdul Ghani, Undersecretary of the Multilateral Economics and Environment Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia. Her division is in charge of economic and environment issues within the multilateral realm, encompassing issues concerning trade, finance, the SDGs, as well as climate change. Ms. Aznifa has been with the ministry for almost 20 years and has been assigned to several multilateral divisions throughout her stint in the ministry. She was also part of Malaysia's delegation to the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, held in Glasgow, Scotland in October 2021. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Aznifa. It's great to see a familiar face.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Next, we have Dr. Hu Chiu Ping, a senior lecturer in strategic studies and international relations at the National University of Malaysia, UKM. She conducts lectures for the undergraduate courses on the dynamics of international system, as well as postgraduate courses focusing on major powers in East Asia, contemporary international relations, and research methodology in security and strategic analysis. Dr. Hu is also a council member of the Consultative Council on Foreign Policy, CCFP, formed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2021. The Consultative Council serves as a platform for its members to provide their views and inputs in the process of formulating foreign policy that aligns with Malaysia's national interests. Thank you for sparing the time with us today, Doctor.
Thank you for having me here.
And last but not least, Ms. Izzah Khairina Ibrahim, an analyst in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies Center from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS. Ms. Izzah graduated from the Australian National University, ANU, with a master's in strategic studies. She has also completed her double degree at the same university with a bachelor's in international relations and a bachelor of Asia Pacific Studies. Her research areas include foreign policy and security developments in the Asia Pacific, including the ongoing unrest in southern Thailand and southern Philippines, and non-traditional security developments in Southeast Asia. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Izzah.
Thank you for having me.
And my name is Daniel Akhtar from the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, IDFR, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. As we are all aware, Malaysia was applauded, yet also criticized in our response to the issue of Ukraine-Russia. On one hand, Malaysia supported a UN resolution against Russia. On the other hand, we abstained from the vote on the UN resolution for Russia to be suspended from the Human Rights Council. This question is to Ms. Aznifa. Where does Malaysia stand in this?
Thank you, Daniel. Indeed, this is it's a hot button issue.
this is a day-to-day occurrence now. It seems like since February we're seeing more news as such already making headlines. As you know, Malaysia has we have long held the position where we do not wish to meddle in the affairs of another country, another nation. We believe in, at the same time, we believe in the sovereign integrity and sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states, all nations, all sovereign nations. It is no secret that Malaysia has made a very pronounced statement in the multilateral platform that we wish to not be aligned to anyone when it comes to the entire conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But it is important to also highlight that this by no means Malaysia is trying to make excuses for any one party for being the cause or for taking action that runs contrary to international law or the UN Charter. We have long held the belief that we are friends with all and enemy of none. But we also believe that certain aspects of this position must be seen closely, must be looked on closely. Although we do have a neutral position, we do not wish to take sides, we do not want to take positions or choose anyone who's right or who's wrong, which is now it's now being put into question because that's now the reality of multilateralism. We are quite clear that, or whether we're more concerned about the most immediate reaction to this conflict. There are many parties we are seeing now, they are just eager to just start laying blame to one party, saying that they have violated international law, they have ruined the key principles of multilateralism. But that's just one half of the story. But I believe that the reaction to that, the kind of behavior or the result of that is even more damaging to multilateralism itself, and not just for the most immediate future, but also in the long run. We don't necessarily agree with this approach. As you know, there has been many attempts, and still is now, on various multilateral or international organizations to start pointing fingers. This country has been wrong. This country has been guilty of invading. It's been guilty for mongering war and now starting a war. Well, the war is there, the conflict is there, no doubt. But the next steps is not to just add fuel to fire. I think the most immediate step is for all parties to de-escalate and to find the best way forward to find a peaceful resolution. That has always been the hallmark of Malaysia's multilateral approach and diplomacy. But however, on the multilateral platform, this has been increasingly challenging. Various multilateral platforms, international organizations, even specialized or technical bodies, being the ground for politicization, forcing countries to take sides, to choose between who's right and who's wrong, and whether you're with us or you're not with us. So that is not a very healthy trend in my view.
Yeah, building on to the point that you've made, the future of multilateralism, right? Against this backdrop of the complex and challenging landscape that we're facing right now, let's take a step back. Where does Malaysia stand in all of this? What's the bigger picture of multilateralism?
Essentially, the ultimate goal is to ensure that we have to uphold a common interest, and usually this common interest almost always, most of the time, coincides with our own national interests.
Yeah.
That meeting point, that commonality, is what what we always look for. We always create coalitions among member states where we could find a middle ground. We push for the most important aspects, what we want, whether it's peace, whether it's observance for human rights, whether it is about equity, justice. So the common ground is the most important thing, and ultimately is achieving a common interest, and we project that in the international stage so we can all live by the same rules and principles and ideals.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Aznifa. Dr. Hu, it's obvious that Malaysia is not a major power, but as mentioned by Ms. Aznifa, Malaysia plays its role in the multilateral fora proactively, diligently, in fact. But what kind of power do we have in terms of influence, and how relevant is the UN for Malaysia? What are your thoughts, Dr. Hu?
Thank you so much for the question. So the position of Malaysia being one of the smaller countries in Southeast Asia, so we have been punching above our weight, I would say, reviewing the history of our foreign policies. So amidst highly tension and conflictual situations, such as even when Indonesia launched Ganyang Malaysia against our establishment, however, we managed to reach a consensus. And with the countries that doubt our intention of forming a new sovereign entity, we reached an agreement and formed ASEAN in 1967. So it is not easy to attain that kind of consensus. And moving from distrust, we built confidence and trying to make multilateralism work. And over the years, we admit more ASEAN members, now 10 member states. So the Ukraine issue, the Myanmar issues, in a way is testing our capability to express where do we stand in terms of the morality and power in international system. Multilateralism ultimately is about cooperation. So when we wanted to ensure that cooperation is successful, we are trying to find what are the converging interests among the member states. So this is done through United Nations. So as you said earlier, Malaysia has taken different position on 2 different votes. And this is also because, just like what Ms. Aznifa has said, that we are not trying to make enemies. So by having a black and white choices to force us into a situation where we cannot prevent ourselves from facing confrontational situation, this is not what Malaysia and other smaller countries would want. Yeah. So as a smaller countries, we are actually qualified as a kind of a smaller state that value common interests, cooperation, and for peace and stability in the international system. So when everything is against this trend, then we would try to assert ourselves. And this assertion is a form of maintaining our state autonomy and agency. So as a member of an international organization, every sovereign state have equal 1 vote. Yeah. So that vote, meaning that we have to assert our autonomy as a sovereign state, in which other states have to respect our choices. So this is where Malaysia can sometimes be known as a middle power. In academic discourse, there are many interpretations about what is middle power. Politically, Malaysia don't announce that we are a middle power, but I would like to highlight 3 characteristics of what I have just talked about. The first one is activism. So since the 80s, we have been actively advocating for neutrality, non-aligned, so the principles and the moral values that we cherish until today. So we are consistently championing for Palestinian human rights, and in various issues affecting Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and the world. So secondly would be about agency. So what agency does smaller country have? So in that way, we are trying to promote collaboration, capacity building. So we even set up Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh to help Rohingya refugee. So that shows our commitment, and we invest in the resources that we can do in other countries. So internationally at the United Nations, we have chaired many committees, including Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference and also the review on various issues. And our chairmanship at the United Nations Security Council is always being applauded by other nations, being one of responsible and practical. So with that, I would like to hear from our fellow panelists on other issues. Thank you.
Yeah, still being heard up until now. When we were chairman of the UN Security Council back in 2015, 2016. That's 7 years, right? My math's not so good, right? But let's talk about ASEAN and the situation in Myanmar. Despite ASEAN's leverages on Myanmar, key regional major powers remain adamant about staying on the sideline and playing a role more as observers to the situation in Myanmar. Some may have expressed strong statements and even sanctions, but none has so far looked assertive enough in the effort to change the status quo. It's been a year and more. Ms. Iza, in your opinion, how can multilateralism, including through regional organizations like ASEAN and its external partners, stay relevant amidst these challenging and complex landscape?
I think first and foremost, there is something that we can't discount, that when it comes to multilateralism and regionalism, a lot of the questions they look, one of the few things that they do still provide key benefits. No matter how you look at it, there's still some things that they can still accomplish. So one of it would be that, one, they maximize cooperation and also mitigate risk that would have come if you were doing it independently. So by doing that, by greater cooperation, there are more positive spillover effects, and that encourages other people to do the same. Second, there's the issue that it's also being able to share public goods better. By encouraging these sort of multilateral exchanges and all that, it shows that public goods, like the vaccine as well recently, is a good example that by this sort of cooperation, it's just from a view of pragmatism, it works. So, but the issue is that nowadays, there are always questions about, do we really need it in the end? Like, while these are benefits, there are still issues that plague multilateral organizations to this day, such as bureaucratic bloat, questions of certain members. So a good example is the permanent 5 members of the UN having way too much power. Some could say maybe they're leaning towards particular agendas. You can say maybe it's more Western or developed country leaning and leaving the rest of the world behind. These are legitimate issues. We are not going to deny that. And adding on top with the COVID-19 pandemic, where it really shows a lot of these organizations lagged behind. Yeah. So like the G20 didn't do much. The UN Security Council announced resolution.
Yeah, a bit later.
A little bit, yeah. It's a bit too late after, it was several months or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. It shows that they were lagging, and it did not help because this was also occurring at the time where a lot of unilateral behavior, especially like led by countries such as the US, they started showing that, fine, they're doing it alone, let's everyone starts turning inwards. And so by doing that, it's already an uphill battle for them, and it's not going to be easy. So there's a few things that they really need to do, and some of them is a bit of a bitter pill to swallow. So one of it would be like reform, like the UN, ASEAN. I know ASEAN catches a lot of flack for being talk shops, and especially with like Myanmar and all that. You can make all these public declarations, but if you are not willing to make the move, if you are not willing to sit together and address some sensitive issues, but with respect, of course, no one's asking you to start pointing fingers angrily. Like, if these cannot be met, it's quite unfortunate that they will remain as such talk shops. So reform will be one of them, but it will need the agreement and the cooperation and commitment by all of these member countries, member committees. And second would be also considering that they need to be able to be relevant in the sense that it's no longer major conflict, it's not the Cold War. You have to start thinking about what are the big issues happening today. Climate change, increasing digitalization of the world, human security issues such as access to healthcare and public goods. We really need to start bringing these up. We can't just vaguely talk about them, but we have to be able to incorporate them not just on the international platform, but also to bring it into the countries to make sure that these goals, these ideals are going to be met. And the last one I would say also is to be a bit realistic in the sense that we can aim big, but at the same time we have to see what can be managed first. You can't make lofty goals without starting from the bottom, because that's where you can get the most traction and that can be able to be set for the long term.
Wow, that is a very interesting discussion from our fellow panelists. Before we move on to the next session, perhaps we can take a short break and then we'll begin in a moment. Welcome back to the Let's Talk series. Let's talk multilaterality, the realities of the 21st, the reality of multilateralism in the 21st century. Welcome to our fellow panelists. We have Ms. Aznifa, Dr. Hu, and Ms. Iza. So the next session, before I ask the next question, I want to talk about the three principles that Dr. Hu mentioned just now, the three A's. So first we have the activism, second is agency, and Dr. Hu, could you perhaps elaborate more on the third A? What was it again?
Yeah, sure. So sorry for forgetting that.
I know.
So actually it's about autonomy. So I mentioned it earlier in my remarks, but I would like to further emphasize that state autonomy is crucial in enable our voice be heard at the regional or international level, and surely in the reality of the multilateralism. So one thing that we have done so far is to hold on to our position consistently. So consistency led us to have a position, a firm position on issues that matter to us. So I believe that this also led us to be accepted as part of the Human Rights Council's member, and it is because of that that we abstained our vote against Russia's HRC's membership. So it is understandable. And to maintain the multilateral relations that we have, so it is a compelled position that we must hold on to. Otherwise, we would known as countries without autonomy. So in that way, when we're building up on our state autonomy, when it is extended to the regional level and therefore accepted and agreed upon by the regional organization members such as ASEAN, then we form a regional autonomy. So we further enhance multilateralism to get everyone in the regional organization on board on the issues that matter the most, such as South China Sea issues. So we have a process on the ASEAN-China COC process, and that also gets agreement from state that doesn't have a stake in South China Sea. So this is another example of how we asserted our activism, agency, and autonomy.
Right. In other words, I believe that it's Malaysia carrying a voice, and as we've all discussed just now, Malaysia has a voice at the United Nations. But Malaysia is one of the leading voices in ASEAN because we're one of the founding members of ASEAN. So what can Malaysia do with what it's been doing and what it has done to ensure that with our voice we make multilateralism relevant, and we make the United Nations and ASEAN relevant as well? Ms. Iza?
I think to maintain relevance, one of the things that we do need to consider is that we have the foundations set in to make sure that we are ready for the long run. One of the few things that's important is to maintain is how we look at it, especially in our foreign policy. How much it shows not just setting guidelines on what we want to do, but also showing that we have the commitment to do this. It's not just a way for us to get international brownie points. We're not going to just do it for lip service or just to look good. It's something that we have to show that we've internalized these values and that we are committed to make sure that it's not just us doing it, that we're going to be doing it on an international level and produce the reality we want, which is a peaceful, stable, and prosperous community. And one of it I think they need to address is to make sure that we do prioritize these multilateral and regional institutions. I think one of the good examples of this is with ASEAN as well. This isn't just an issue with Malaysia, but even the own member states, while they like to show that they're there for ASEAN, they are not ready when push comes to shove. They don't. They are not there to actually walk the walk when it comes to a lot of these issues. So this includes stuff like the issues of Myanmar. They don't talk about issues of standardizing and meeting and trying to elevate fellow countries on the same level. As we can see, like there's quite a considerable gap between the more developed ASEAN countries versus those such as Cambodia, Laos, and all that. So that's one of the big issues. Like if they can't standardize and meet that level, we also lose an element to keep them relevant. They become pushed to the back in favor for something else. They push for something more preferable, more attractive to them. So that's why you see a lot of them breaking off and going with other countries such as China or the US, because they have the appeal and also the protection based on what they can provide as opposed to what ASEAN collectively can do as well. And it goes back too. So for that to go that far, we have to make sure we have things put in place, and it has to be done from the government and not something that maybe one person can carry, which we have done before.
Ms. Iza, I believe that Ms. Asifah, perhaps you can expound on that point. Like, what has Malaysia been doing and has done at the UN?
Thank you. This is very interesting because let me just go back first on the question of relevance. For in terms of practice, ASEAN or any being a member of any multilateral body, it's extremely relevant. We go back to within the regional pillar, being part of ASEAN and having some kind of desire that resolute want or need to mobilize a common ground, a common ideal, and to push it through the body that we represent is to me some kind of legitimacy that Malaysia is also provided being part of the union, and with that common, well, if you can see consensus, so to speak, on several issues, on vaccines, on digitalization, on blue economy, sustainable development. It's a platform, a springboard of a platform to amplify this ideas, these ideals, this push within the context of the United Nations, and it can even go beyond that. If we wish to visit a few other multilateral bodies. Of course, it does not come without challenges. It does, like what Iza was saying. But I'm not going to be very idealistic, saying, "Oh, that's easily overcome." No, it's not. But which is why good things are never come easy for us. So we've always been quite unrelentless, quite stubborn to a certain degree. The region has always had these principles, and when we have this legitimacy in pushing forward certain ideals, and at the UN, it's depending on which platform within the UN system, it's always been said this is an ASEAN position. An ASEAN position carries a lot of weight. It's not the voice of one country; it's the voice of 10 countries of that region. We represent our people, 500 million people in population. What's not relevant for that? So I think that it's extremely powerful tool. It's extremely powerful voice, and this is something that Malaysia, and I believe all, if not most, ASEAN countries will continue to ride on. for many more years to come. But of course, we'll still have to work our kinks here and there.
I love what Dr. Hu mentioned just now. She mentioned consistency. Malaysia is very consistent in its position, very resolute in its position in upholding multilateralism. We know multilateralism works. To a certain extent, yes, it has its challenges and the complexities of multilateralism. But drawing upon this, I would like to invite fellow panelists and share their thoughts about the role of the United Nations and even Malaysia to encourage and inculcate states to uphold multilateralism. Certain states are claiming that unilateralism is an act of defending their national interests. However, in reality, this contradicts with the essence of multilateralism. It would be great if our panelists today could share their thoughts on this. Perhaps Ms. Aznifa?
Thank you, Daniel. In not so many words, although there has been some shortcomings here and there, maybe certain shortcomings are even bigger than others, but multilateralism has, by and large, been the most effective tool in ensuring that the tragedies of the past, as evidenced in history, never repeats itself. That the world never has to see another nuclear bombing. The world never has to see millions of people lose their lives in different parts across continents over world wars. And for that reason, although in the largest parts of history we have seen in the last 77 years, that history does not repeat itself, and that multilateralism has been useful, has been effective, but much remains to be done. Of course, multilateralism within the context of the United Nations and the UN system, and of course perhaps all other intergovernmental organizations or regional bodies, for that matter, can improve itself. It's the convening power that's, in my view, that's the most important. The United Nations and all other intergovernmental bodies have been successful in convening important gatherings of member states, of its members, to sit and have a engagement or discuss or debate about issues that are important to the peace and security of the world or of that region, of those few countries involved, or on issues of particular importance, like for example the pandemic, and find ways to mobilize most immediate actions necessary, humanitarian assistance, for example, most immediate aid to people, those most in need, people living in most vulnerable conditions, small islands, for example, in amidst disasters. So the power of multilateralism has been proven. It has a track record. It's not perfect, but it's there. It can definitely be improved. One way, perhaps like what Ms. Izzah mentioned earlier, perhaps to avoid some bodies from being labeled as a talk shop, perhaps the time has come to revisit or maybe to consider looking at a reform of sorts. And that's certainly being discussed now. That's certainly on the table. Malaysia is a very strong advocate for the need for UN reform, Security Council reform, for example. Malaysia has been very active. And so going back to what I was mentioning, yes, it's relevant. Yes, much more can be done. It has proven that it has worked in the past. Malaysia has been involved in various aspects, not just our role in the UN. We have even hosted the NAM Summit, the OIC Summit, various ASEAN summits, and many other smaller meetings, regional meetings that we have held here. And of course, detractors can always say, you're just, organizing meetings, but that's just optics. But somehow the key messages, the deliverables, the takeaways that not just as hosts, but also as participants in those meetings are what's most important. The commitment demonstrating real effort in ensuring that what we agreed does carry forward, has its meaning. And for Malaysia, this is something that we'll continue to do. And of course, we strive to improve in ways that we can, which is why meetings like this are important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Azifah. Dr. Hu, what are your thoughts on encouraging states to uphold multilateralism?
So I think in addition to what Ms. Azifah has shared, one of the very important walking the talk so it's one of the feature of multilateralism. And through Malaysia, through many platforms, not just United Nations and also ASEAN and international NGOs, we have actually support many of the values and activities that matter to us, reflecting not only the value that is cherished by the nation but also by its people. So for example, Malaysia has been part of the first 50 nations to sign on the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So as what Ms. Azifah has said, to prevent another nuclear catastrophe from taking place on this earth again. And we never doubt in the possibility of banning nuclear weapons, and therefore we pledge and sign and ratify this treaty. So on other issues such as environmental, so Paris Agreement is one of the most one of the very brilliant international agreement in which almost all nation states has signed on to it. So I think by pledging our words and values together and working with even with United Nations agencies, for example, we have a national working group by UNDP, UNESCO, and so on. So we contribute not only in terms of national development agenda, we also actively supporting such activities in other countries as well. So I think, for example, even if we are alone in the voice, like on Palestinian issues or Myanmar, so the Myanmar crisis also illustrates our foreign ministry is not afraid to express what is really crucial about treasuring the human rights, the value of democracy. So we have spoken to the representative of National Unity Government. So this is something that we may be taking a very small step that can finally convince the rest of ASEAN member states, for example, to take a braver decision to do the right thing for our region.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. Ms. Iza, do you have any ideas for us to convince other states to uphold multilateralism?
Based on building on the previous two speakers, I think one of the things that we need to think about is proving the legitimacy. Yes, we have a track record, but there are also a newer generation of leaders, people who may not necessarily be aware of what the UN or other international or regional bodies do. So in some way, like you can't just say, yes, they've done well, but do they see it? So that's one of the few examples, like for example, like delivering public goods or aid or any other sort of assistance. If they don't see it, but they're hearing all the fanfare about the greatness of it all, they will start questioning. They will feel, oh, hang on, I don't get it. What is it? So you have to prove to them that not only like you are showing like that you can deliver at the end, but not only that, you need to be more representative of the global population, because it's not just the West, it's not just the developed countries outside of the West. There is also the global South, or however term you want to use nowadays, because the term keeps changing, whichever's popular nowadays. But these people do feel underrepresented in a lot of these spheres, and they're also the places with the most vulnerable populations, and they need to be included too. So not only do they feel seen, heard, and aided, but they also feel like they have, it's like Dr. Hu said, they have the voice. They have the agency to go, I can participate in a better global future and also for the future of my country.
Thank you, Ms. Iza. Okay, so we've talked about Malaysia's, the relevance and then Malaysia's role in multilateralism. And then we talked about how we can convince certain states to uphold them. Also, I think we have yet to talk about the challenges that's evolving and always ever growing, right? So the emergence of truly global problems such as climate change, proliferation of nuclear weapons, of mass destruction, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and the most recent one being food security, have indeed led to an increasing paradox of governance. Hence, in your opinion, Ms. Aznifa, how does Malaysia prepare itself for a renewed multilateralism to address these evolving and upcoming global challenges?
Thank you, Dan. I think it's a multiple step process. Before we talk about how we could address this and how we could do that through multilateralism, I think at least for Malaysia, it is very important at the domestic level that we have a very concrete multi-party coordination, and we need to communicate this what exactly is what kind of ecosystem we want to have now, in future. And we learn from what's happened. We want to try and ensure that we are no longer prone to these kinds of challenges, these kinds of sudden shocks to the whole ecosystem, for example. Now, that's just one thing, but the other, in a more global approach, a more multilateral approach, is how we could find, or we could not really find, we could form a coalition of member states that have a common ideal, common philosophy, common agenda, and how we could work together, merge our strength, and maybe welcome other people who's interested. Maybe pool our resources together to ensure that at the end of it, this is what we can try and obtain. One such example is the Council of Palm Oil Producing Countries, CPOPC. That's just one, how this grouping can enhance the livelihoods or the position of countries who produce palm oil, whether they are on SDGs, whether they're poverty eradication. And it also could do the same, or still is, on food security, for example. That's just one example, but there are many other ways to do it also within the context of multilateralism. So coalition, having a clear set target, clear agenda, and have as many countries come on board and push the agenda forward, and that can be done at various multilateral levels.
All right, thank you, Ms. Aznifa. Ms. Iza, when I mentioned food security, your face sparked with interest. Perhaps you have something to share with us?
It is an issue. It's quite rightly so when you highlighted that food security is becoming an issue, and it's quite concerning that for not just Malaysia in the case, but to address it as an emerging issue, it's still quite difficult for quite a lot of countries. Sure, for us, we've been taking the steps, and we've even highlighted this in our foreign policy frameworks as of the last two, of how important this is and how we should be cultivating better networks, better connections, not just within the country but also internationally and regionally, and how do we mitigate this oncoming threat, because it's still quite difficult because for quite a lot of countries these sort of non-traditional issues are still not considered threats. It's just worrying that we will need to wait for something severe to happen, like let's say COVID-19, for a lot of people to go, healthcare is serious, we need to be doing something about this. So it's quite important nowadays that we should be seeing these things, and it needs I guess, from not just from the grassroots but also those in decision-making positions to advocate for this, and also to be committed to making sure that we address these issues when before they become too late.
All All right, thank you, Ms. Iza. Okay, so before we wrap up our discussion, perhaps we could take a couple of questions from the audience. Anyone?
Hi, good afternoon, panelists. I'm Balkis. So my question would be for Dr. Hu. With the current Ukraine-Russian crisis and Myanmar, Rohingya, as well as the ongoing Palestine issue, will multilateralism be able to help with the growing human rights issue stemming from this crisis?
All right, so I believe that is a question for Dr. Hu, human rights.
Thank you so much, Balkis, for your question. So I think those issues that you highlighted shows division among the nation states that hold very different opinion and sometimes to the extreme of the both sides of the spectrum. So one of the best way to address this would be through global governance. So it was through different platforms such as on human rights, and so the Ukraine-Russia issue actually should have evoked our review of the United Nations Charter, so against states using use of force against another sovereign state. So these are all quite clear, but why United Nations haven't been able to evoke those charters, articles and principles. So otherwise this issue has been long resolved. So one thing that I wanted to highlight as well is the Israel-Palestinian and also the Rohingya issue. Not only they are about human rights, but they are also about historical legacy and also religious cultural conflict. So conflicts can only be resolved through mutual understanding. Peace process is therefore a very important activity to be partaken by almost all sovereign nations. However, they are more often than not being undermined by the major powers. So smaller countries like us have to form a form of a coalition that was mentioned earlier. So without a formidable group of nations that voice against a certain kind of injustice, then we can never see the end of it, and this is why multilateralism become ever more important. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hu. Maybe one more question from the audience.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Isham. I have a question for Ms. Aznifa. Historically speaking, and up until now, there are a lot of issues and disputes unresolved because of this concept of veto power, namely P5. So in your opinion, is this concept still relevant? And if it's not, what is the way forward? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Isham. The question of veto has long been criticized by Malaysia in particular for being abused, evading the most important problems that needs to be resolved. Malaysia has long called for the reform of the United Nations Security Council because of its use of veto. I think Dr. Hu mentioned earlier on, if the situation, the problems that the world is facing evokes the need to review the UN Charter, its use, its importance, its relevance, then all these problems would have been resolved a long time ago. Unfortunately, that this is not so, because whether we like it or not, the more powerful states, the permanent members of the United Nations, for as much as possible, they would not want to let go of whatever power they already have, they wield. So this is a very powerful diplomatic tool they possess in the United Nations to ensure that there's no corrosion of their interests. Simple as that. So whether it's relevant, not so, in my view. it has to be addressed. The discourse surrounding an improved United Nations in its working methods, in its decision making, particularly of the Security Council and perhaps also the General Assembly, is still relevant. The discourse has been ongoing for the last 4 decades at least. Unfortunately, the progress has been very slow. Malaysia has always voiced its position that we would like to see better movement in this issue. We'd like to see better progress, and we'll continue to call for this progress. And we are all hopeful that the world's biggest problems can be resolved based on the principles of the UN Charter in accordance with international law, and who more is well placed to do so than the United Nations Security Council. They are charged with this responsibility, the Charter responsibility. So, and if the Security Council can't function properly, then it will be very difficult for the younger generation, the future of our younger generation.
Thank you, Ms. Aznifa. There is a reason why perhaps we did not touch too much on the power of the veto, because if we were to do so, that would be another Let's Talk series. Right. I think we've had a very interesting and insightful discussion with our fellow panelists today. Malaysia is committed to support multilateralism, founded on the principles stipulated in the United Nations Charter and on the basis of international law, which are indispensable foundation of a more peaceful, prosperous and just world. However, upholding multilateralism in a state-centric would only be possible if all states are treated as equal. We believe that there must be a balance of power among states and a balance of responsibilities and representation for the people. With that, we have come to the end of our session today. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Let's Talk series, Multilatereality, the realities of multilateralism in the 21st century. We hope that you've enjoyed the session and look forward to the next Let's Talk series. Don't forget to subscribe to IDFR's YouTube channel and keep updated with the latest Let's Talk series and happenings around IDFR. With that, my name is Daniel, and thank you for tuning in Let's Talk series. See you soon.